The story begins with several soccer players from the U.S. men's national team playing in a tense championship match. The atmosphere was intense, with everyone eager to see who would win. The U.S. players performed brilliantly, eventually defeating their opponents by a single goal. The players and their supporters erupted with joy. In truth, they had trained for years for this moment, and their hard work was clearly reflected in the result. After claiming the championship title, they prepared to return home. The entire team, along with their coach, boarded the plane, ready for takeoff, completely unaware that what awaited them would shatter their lives forever. Their head coach, overjoyed by the victory, congratulated everyone and said that if they kept winning titles like this, the U.S. soccer team could become truly unbeatable. Once everyone had fastened their seat belts, the plane took off, and the passengers began to relax. Among the team was Slim, a star player who had scored multiple goals and was considered the main reason for their victory. However, Slim didn't seem well. He had a deep fear of heights and had never traveled this far by plane. Sitting next to him was his teammate Andy, who tried to comfort him by telling him to focus on something else until they arrived. Slim's girlfriend, Alina, was also on board, as well as Ava, the fiancée of another player named Felix. They had come along to cheer for their loved ones. The team's trainer, Connie, noticed Slim's condition and gave him medicine to ease his anxiety. Slim trusted him and took it, hoping to feel better soon. But suddenly, the plane's propellers caught fire, and it began losing altitude rapidly as it flew over the ocean. Panic spread among the passengers, and even the pilots couldn't regain control. A crash landing was inevitable. The plane went down, but instead of sinking into the sea, it stopped along the edge of a small, mysterious island. The impact destroyed much of the aircraft, killing many passengers instantly. It took a long time for the survivors to escape the wreckage. Those who made it alive gathered on the shore, surrounded by dead bodies, with more than half of the remaining people injured. Slim and a few others tried to help the wounded while finding a safe place for themselves. The view was nothing but endless ocean in every direction. Andy noticed many injured people and told Connie they should help. But Connie insisted he wasn't a doctor, he didn't know how to treat them. The most he could do was tie cloth around their wounds to stop the bleeding. To make matters worse, most of the plane's supplies had been lost to the water, meaning their condition was only going to get worse from here. After the crash landing, the remaining survivors began counting how many people had died, as the number seemed overwhelmingly high. One by one, they tallied the numbers and realized that out of all the passengers, only a few had survived, and fortunately, those survivors were members of their soccer team. Alina was devastated because her father, who was one of the team's head coaches, had died in the accident. They didn't have much food supply, and no one knew how long they could survive on the island. They gathered whatever belongings they could salvage and set aside all the essential items, knowing they would have to use every resource carefully since there was no guarantee when a rescue team might arrive. Until then, they would have to endure and survive on the island under any circumstances. Slim, while checking his bag, found a mobile phone and became overjoyed, thinking he could use it to contact a rescue team. He quickly shared the news with Andy, but Andy wasn't excited. He pointed out that there was no network signal, meaning the phone was useless. The hope of calling for help vanished instantly. Slim became extremely frustrated, stood up, and then suddenly collapsed unconscious, with blood running from his nose. Nobody knew what was wrong with him, but Connie rushed over and applied whatever first aid he knew. A small shelter was built to keep Slim resting inside. Meanwhile, Andy gathered the remaining food and water supplies and began calculating how long they might last. It was obvious that the supplies wouldn't be enough for the number of survivors, and they would eventually have to endure without food or water. One positive step came from Felix, another player, who arranged pieces of wood on the beach to form a large "help" sign so that any plane or rescue team flying overhead could spot them. However, the condition of the soccer players was getting worse. Some ventured into the water to search for resources that had been lost when the plane crashed. The more supplies they could find, the longer they could survive. After searching for a while, they finally discovered some food items. These needed to be brought back to shore, so a player named Patham handed the supplies to his teammate Marcus, who began swimming toward land. But suddenly, Marcus noticed a shark circling him. Panic set in, his priority became saving his life. He dropped all the supplies into the water and swam as fast as he could toward the shore. The rest of the team members also managed to reach land safely, though without the precious food they had found. Patham was furious with Marcus for dropping so many resources into the water, making them useless. In his anger, Patham even punched Marcus, and the two began fighting. The rest of the group rushed in to break it up. When Andy heard what had happened, he scolded both of them, warning that in their current situation, fighting would only make things worse. Mistakes aside, the fact remained, they had just lost a full day's worth of food. Andy reminded everyone that they needed to work together as a team, otherwise, survival would become nearly impossible. 2 days passed on the mysterious island. By then, Slim had finally regained consciousness, though he was still weak. Everyone tried to motivate him, knowing he was struggling with exhaustion. Andy was relieved to see him awake and updated him on everything that had happened so far. Sadly, they had only 3 to 4 days worth of food left, and no one knew what they would do afterward. Slim suggested they could fish and gather fruits from the island's trees to survive, as there was no other choice. Andy, however, was worried about what would happen if they remained trapped on this island for the rest of their lives. Slim stayed positive, reasoning that the crash would have alerted a rescue team and they would arrive soon. But for some reason, Andy wasn't convinced. Andy then took Slim to see the injured survivors. Judging by their condition, it didn't look like they would live long, especially since there were no advanced medical supplies left. Pulling Slim aside, Andy suggested something shocking. If they stopped giving resources to the injured, who had little chance of survival, they could make their supplies last longer. Slim strongly disagreed. He went to Ryan, one of the injured whose leg was badly hurt. Ryan was thirsty, but water was scarce. Andy had told everyone not to give him any, but Slim ended up giving Ryan his own share, meaning Slim would go without water for a whole day. Tensions between the group continued to rise. That night, Andy openly said they should kill the injured to save resources. Slim and most of the others were completely against the idea. Andy's mindset had clearly grown more negative, but the group made a final decision. They would share what they had and survive together, no matter what. Still, spirits were low, as their supplies were nearly gone. Later that night, one of the injured members died from his wounds, something everyone had sadly anticipated. The next morning, they buried him. In the forest, a player named George was searching for anything useful when he suddenly stumbled upon something surprising, another small island connected to theirs. Shocked, he ran back to tell Andy and the others. This meant they had another option. They could check if the other island had resources. From a distance, they could see it clearly, but it was far enough that only those who could swim well could attempt the trip. The hope was that even if their own island supplies were gone, the other island might hold something useful. Slim, still too weak, wasn't told about the plan and continued to rest. Andy and 3 others set out, swimming toward the second island. Little did they know, something mysterious awaited them there. After traveling in whatever way they could, they finally made it to the second island. But soon they realized that there was nothing here either. All around were only wild trees and plants, with fruits they couldn't eat. Without resources or food and water, it would be impossible for them to survive even a single day. According to human anatomy studies, the human body can survive without water for a minimum of 3 days and, at most, about a week. Without food, a person can live for around 3 weeks minimum, and up to a month at most. Beyond that, survival is impossible. So, Andy and his companions kept exploring in hopes of finding something. Meanwhile, Slim had no idea what was happening with the others. He went straight to his friend Connie, who was sitting at the edge of a cliff. Slim thought that talking might help distract him. Connie told him he had found some berries in the forest, but unfortunately, they were all poisonous and inedible. From Connie's expression, it was clear he had lost all hope. His face showed pure despair as he kept repeating that they were probably going to die here and that no one was coming to rescue them. Slim realized his friend was sinking deep into depression, so he tried to encourage him, saying that the rescue team must already be on their way. They would have gotten the signals that the plane had crashed. All they needed to do was stick together and survive on this abandoned island no matter what. Everything seemed fine until Slim got up to leave, and saw Connie jump from the cliff in a desperate suicide attempt. Slim immediately dove into the water to save him, but despite his efforts, Connie was already gone. His head had struck the side of the mountain, killing him instantly. All Slim could do was bring his friend's body back to shore. Back on the other island, the rest of the group was gathering whatever they could: wood, inedible fruits, anything that might be useful. In the forest, George and Joey were pushing forward when Joey suddenly slipped and fell, injuring himself badly. George rushed over to help him and noticed skeletons of soldiers scattered around. It was clear that this island had once been a war zone, where soldiers had been trapped and killed. The two imagined that they might share the same fate. As they continued on, Joey accidentally stepped on a landmine. The explosion was massive, echoing across the island. Andy and the others heard it and sprinted toward the forest. They found Joey with his leg completely shattered and struggling to breathe. Joey was actually Andreo's cousin, so they immediately tried to get him to the other island for help. Andy wanted to call Connie for medical aid, but had no idea Connie was already dead. When they returned to their original island, they were stunned. In a single night, many lives had been lost. Joey was in excruciating pain, with no chance of treatment on the island. That night, Andy couldn't bear to watch his cousin suffer any longer. In that condition, the only mercy he could offer was to end his cousin's life so he wouldn't have to endure the pain. It was a heartbreaking decision, but Andy carried it out. Now filled with anger, Andy told the group that from now on, if anyone in the team was severely injured, they would be killed immediately. This way, their limited resources wouldn't be wasted on the wounded. The group was now down to just 7 people, but none of them knew that, soon, every one of them would be dead. By this point, an entire day had already passed. On this abandoned island, everything changed for Andy after his brother's death. His behavior shifted drastically, and he wandered into the forest, breaking down in tears. At that moment, Slim's girlfriend, Elena, approached him to comfort and encourage him, reminding him that staying united was crucial. If they didn't align their thoughts, conflict could break out, and instead of focusing on survival, they'd end up fighting among themselves. Fortunately, several people had spotted a raft near the shore. Everyone thought they could use it to escape the island, but Felix and Riva argued it would be better to use the raft's materials to build a trap for catching fish. They even went to Slim to ask for his opinion. However, 2 members, Patham and Steven, insisted the raft should be used for escape since it seemed like their only way out. Slim disagreed, saying it was just a basic draft that couldn't travel far. If they tried to escape on it, it would likely tear apart in the water. In the end, Slim allowed Felix to use it for fishing traps, which infuriated Patham and Steven. Later, Felix placed the raft in one spot, but soon discovered Patham and Steven had stolen it. They tried to leave secretly, and although some people spotted them, by the time Slim and the others moved to stop them, the two had already drifted far away. The group returned to shore, deeply discouraged. Then Simon, another member, pointed out that Patham and Steven had likely taken a large portion of the food supplies with them. Since Simon was in charge of overseeing the remaining food, his claim left everyone shocked. Without those resources, survival seemed impossible. Slim was equally disappointed. But soon the truth came out: Simon had lied. Patham and Steven hadn't taken the food, Simon had hidden it for himself. Marcus and several others caught him in the act. When they confronted him, Simon tried to run, but there was nowhere to escape on this deserted island. Furious, the group attacked him for his betrayal. That food was meant for everyone, yet Simon wanted it for himself. When Andy learned the truth, his rage intensified. Still grieving his brother's death, he completely lost control. He grabbed a knife and tried to stab Simon repeatedly. Felix and Slim rushed to pull them apart, but in the chaos, Andy accidentally slashed Felix's neck. Blood poured out as the group watched in shock. Felix had been one of the few who still carried hope, but now he lay dead. That night, Andy made up his mind. He realized no rescue was coming. His plan was to head to another island in search of food and water. Several members, seeing no other choice, agreed with him. That's why they all agreed to go with Andy. But Slim said he hoped some rescue team would eventually come to save them, so he decided to stay on the first island and wait. His girlfriend Elena stayed with him, and Simon also chose to remain there. The rest went with Andy to the other island. Now, the group was split in two: Slim's group on one side and the unstable Andy's group on the other. The next day, Andy and his companions began trying to catch fish in the sea or find other ways to secure food supplies. But despite repeated efforts, they found nothing. Over time, they grew weaker, and their hope completely faded. In such conditions, the human mind can behave in strange ways. In many cases, people have been known to kill and eat their own companions. However, no one had crossed that line yet. On the first island, Slim, who knew some survival techniques, began collecting seashells from underwater. He also taught Elena and Simon how to gather drinkable water. They started following his methods, setting up spots to collect rainwater. Gradually, they managed to store some water, which at least kept them partially hydrated. But one morning, they discovered that a member of Andy's group had come to their island and stolen their water. Slim, Elena, and Simon were shocked. If this continued, Andy's group would keep coming back to steal more. Reluctantly, Slim swam to the other island to speak with Andy. Slim had already managed to gather some food and water using his techniques, so he suggested they should all join forces and survive together. But Andy, now completely negative-minded, refused and told Slim to go back to his own island, insisting they would survive on their own. Realizing Andy wouldn't listen, Slim left, but he knew Andy and his friends would soon try to attack them and take their resources. The two groups had now become enemies. Survival wasn't just about finding food and water anymore, it was also about protecting themselves from their former companions. Meanwhile, Andy's condition was deteriorating, and he even began hallucinating about his dead brother. These visions only made him more aggressive. Then we see another member, Ernie, secretly approaching Elena. Ernie, who had completely lost his mind, tried to assault her. Elena ran deep into the forest to escape, but she couldn't hide from him for long. Ernie caught her and tried to force himself on her. She struggled to break free, but he slammed her head against the ground, knocking her unconscious. Ernie was startled. He hadn't expected this and feared she might be dead. At that moment, Simon, who had witnessed everything, appeared, along with Marcus, who was standing nearby. Simon immediately ran off to warn Slim, while Ernie chased after him, but Simon had already gotten far away. Ernie told Marcus not to tell Andy about what happened, threatening that if word got out, he would blame Simon. Marcus knew full well Ernie was guilty and was just trying to cover his tracks. Simon managed to make his way back to the first island and told Slim everything. Elena was still lying unconscious in the forest, so Slim knew he had to save her. The others warned him that Andy and his friends might attack, but Slim didn't think twice. He headed straight for the other island to rescue her. Once in the forest, Slim finally found Elena. He quickly picked her up and carried her to a safe spot to protect her. But Slim had no idea that Andy and his friends were already prepared. They knew Slim had come. Slim decided he wouldn't sit quietly. He would remove every threat that could harm his companions. His dark skin actually worked to his advantage. Surrounded by darkness, he blended in perfectly. Annie, who was holding a torch, suddenly spotted Slim and lunged at him to attack. But Marcus appeared from behind and struck Annie on the head, pushing him away. At that moment, Andy also arrived and drove Marcus off. Somehow, Slim managed to get Elena back with Simon, but when they returned, they discovered Andy's group had burned their entire base camp and supplies. Without them, they wouldn't survive even a single day. Frustrated beyond measure, Slim decided there was only one option left: to eliminate Andy's people one by one before they could destroy the rest of them. First, he took out Marcus, and then Ernie, whom they killed by luring him into a trap. Now, only one enemy remained: Andy himself. When Slim and the others reached the shore, Andy was already there, challenging Slim to a fight. They stood face to face, and the battle began. Both men fought savagely, trying to kill each other, injuring one another badly. The fight dragged on until, suddenly, the sound of helicopters filled the air. Rescue teams had arrived, their lights cutting through the night. Everyone was overjoyed, except Andy, who had lost all hope and realized he had been wrong all along. In a burst of frustration, Andy ran back into the island's interior. Slim and the survivors began boarding the rescue helicopters. The rescuers explained that two men, Patham and Stephen, had escaped earlier and given them the island's location. One by one, the survivors climbed aboard. A rescue officer asked Slim if anyone else was still on the island. Slim paused for a moment, then replied that there was no one else. The helicopters lifted off, leaving the abandoned island behind. Andy stood alone, watching them disappear into the distance. Broken inside, he decided to remain there forever. And so, our story ends on this tragic note.